Comfort, O comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that she has served her term, that her penalty is paid, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. A voice cries out in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain, and then the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all people shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. This is the word of our Lord. Please be seated. Friends, I believe in miracles. I've seen too many things happen in my life and the lives of others. I cannot not believe in miracles. And beginning this Sunday through the Christmas season, I want to think with you about miracles. For I believe that most of us do not have a good understanding of what a biblical miracle looks like or what it means to even think about a miracle. And we certainly live in a culture that does not take miracles seriously but discounts the very possibility. For the Bible, a miracle is God's intervention in human history. Maybe in ways very large and obvious, maybe in ways very small and subtle, but in ways that are very real. An intervention that can change the course of nations, that can change the course of an individual life. And to help us understand more about the way miracles work in the Bible, I've always appreciated the writing of C.S. Lewis in his book on miracles, in which he says it's a mistake when you read the Bible to think of all these individual miracles as disconnected. And you know, that can happen. We read the Bible, we read all these stories, and there's a miracle here, there's a miracle here, and we just don't see a pattern anywhere. And then it becomes kind of hard to look at our own lives and see it. Several weeks ago, I thought there was God's intervention, but then Texas snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. So, even then. But Lewis said, actually, we were looking at it wrong. He said, when you think about all the miracles in the Bible, understand that the Bible is actually about one grand miracle, just one. It's about God acting through the Lord Jesus Christ to reach down into the muck and the mire of human sin and despair and to lift us up to the salvation and light of God's grace. Lewis said, when you think of the Bible, think of an amazingly powerful swimmer. And he's standing up in highest heaven, and he's clothed in glory and joy and power. And what does a swimmer do before he gets in the water? Takes it all off. Think of that swimmer taking it all off and then diving down into the depths of the sin and death holding this world captive, all the way down, away from the light and warmth of heaven into the darkness and murky and cold depth of the sin and decay and muck holding this world captive, so that he might then reascend into the warmth and the light up above. But in his reascending into the warmth and the light up above, he is holding in his hand something very, very precious, which he has received from the bottom. Lewis said, when you think of that deep dive from heaven, that's Christmas. That's Christmas. God diving from heaven to become part of the misery and despair holding so much of this earth captive. When you think of the reascension into the light, that's Easter. And what is the precious thing the swimmer is holding in his hands as he reascends into the light? That's you and me. As we're willing to let the Christ grab hold of our lives and take us to places we can never get on our own, but will bring us fully and truly alive. And every miracle in the Bible, in one way or another, relates to this grand miracle. You see, when you walk out of here today, I want you to have a way of understanding the Bible as a whole, and especially the Old Testament leading up to it, the New Testament, but I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Every miracle in the Bible relates to the grand miracle. All those back before, leading up to it, preparing the world for the grand dive, that deep dive into sin and misery, all those afterward flowing out of it as the church went about the business and the power of Christ of lifting all humanity up to the light and the salvation of God's grace, a job that is not finished yet but has begun. In the weeks to come, we're going to look at miracles, and we're going to learn from the Christmas story. We're going to talk about how God uses time and timing to work miracles in your life. We're going to talk about what it means for you and me to participate in these miracles. We're going to look at the star over Bethlehem. I think most of us underestimate that, but that was serious, and it was real. Astronomers tell us it was real. But today, to get us going, I want us to get this idea in our mind of the Bible being the story of the deep dive and the reascension, the one grand miracle. Without Christmas, there could be no Easter. Without Easter, Christmas has no meaning. They're two sides of the same coin. And as you begin to get your mind around that, I want to spend our time today looking at those miracles, God's interventions in history leading up to the deep dive at Christmas. Prepare ye the way of the Lord, said Isaiah in chapter 40. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. And as you begin to understand the Old Testament, you will begin to realize that all the way through the Old Testament, you've got this theme developing until by the end of the Old Testament, it is almost a crescendo. It is so loud and so strong. God preparing the earth for the coming of the Son, for the coming of the one who would make that deep dive into human misery at Christmas. And I think we need to take that seriously. Because you see, it's not just that God prepared the world for Christmas, but God is at work in our lives long before we realize it, and He is preparing us. And as we are willing to learn to recognize God's preparation in our lives and learn to see the way He is working in our lives, we can begin to recognize Him when He intervenes in our lives in ways large or often small, but still that intervention is very real. And it can make all the difference in the world. The thing is, though, that it is so easy to miss. It is so easy to miss if we have not prepared, if we are not expecting it. Some of you know that one of my favorite Christmas stories came out of a posh neighborhood in Beverly Hills a number of years ago. A lady was working in her kitchen. She was getting ready. She had lots of family coming over. And the doorbell rang, and she didn't really have time to answer the doorbell, but she went to the doorbell, and she opened it up, and there were carolers. It was the last thing in the world she had time for. There were all these children there, and an older gentleman in the back with a Santa cap kind of flopping over his forehead, and they were singing. And what do you do? So she was polite, and she said, "Oh, thank you so much. Merry Christmas, goodbye." And she even offered them money, you know. Maybe they were for money, but they didn't want any money, and she got them out really fast. And then about 2 hours later, a neighbor called her and asked if she had seen the carolers, and she said, yeah, I did. And the neighbor informed her that was Bing Crosby at the back. And Bing Crosby had taken all of his grandchildren around caroling the neighborhood. And in recalling that moment, she said, "Oh, how I wished somebody had warned me, how I wish I'd been prepared, how I wish I'd been expecting something unusual to happen. I never even looked at him or recognized him when he came." Jesus Christ was born 2,000 years ago that he might be born into your life in new or renewing ways this year. God will intervene in your life. Maybe it's large, maybe it's small. But there is a terrible chance that you can miss him and not even recognize him. He's some old guy at the back. Unless you're willing to think about God's activity already in your life, preparing you. And it can help if you will understand how God prepared the world for that first Christmas. So let's get to it. I'm going to give you 6 things that God taught the ancient Hebrews that through them were taught, he wanted taught to the world, and frankly have been in many, many ways. I want to ask you to write these down. I want to ask you to write these down because you're going to walk out of here with a way of understanding everything in the Old Testament. Everything in the Old Testament. And I said this at 8:45, and all these people coming through saying, "Would you say this to me again? I really didn't take you seriously, and I wish I'd taken notes." And I said, "No, watch it on television." But I didn't really. I go ahead and gave it to them. But I want you to write this down. I want you to write this down because for too many of us, the Old Testament has great stories, but we get lost in it. We get lost in it. And then I'm going to give you something to do with it at the end. Here's the first thing. Now, let's just visualize. Let's just imagine you're God. You're God, and you're standing up in highest heaven, and you're looking down at a world captured by sin and death. And you're getting ready to make that deep dive down into the misery of the world to lift humanity up out of its sin and death. What's the first step? What's the first thing you would do? Well, you may think, well, the first thing I'd do is let everybody know that there's a God. But that actually was not necessary because people already knew there were gods or a God. People already had a belief in God. It's an interesting thing. Sociologists have never found a culture that does not have a working understanding of God or gods. Romans chapter 1 says that the reason is that when we were created, God's fingerprints were left on our hearts. And we really cannot not believe. We may just not be believing in the right God, but even the people that say they don't believe in the last moments have a tendency to recover it. What you do, if you're God looking down, the issue is not, is there a God? The issue is, do you know the right God? Do you know the right God? And so reaching down, God in Genesis chapter 12 tapped Abraham and Sarah on the shoulder. And he said, "I want you to go to a new land." They lived in Ur, which is now in the southern part of Iraq. He said, "I want you to go to a new land. You're going to go over to a place called Palestine in the Mediterranean, on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. You're going to travel far to the west. And there you're going to start a new nation. I'm going to grow of you a new people. And I'm going to bless you. And through you, I'm going to bless the whole world, all the families of the nations." And that's how he started. What was he doing? He was introducing himself to the world. And that's really the first thing you find being learned in the Old Testament through God's intervention. That to talk about God is to talk about the God who is with us. The God who is with us. That's actually what Emmanuel means. Emmanuel means, when you sing it in the carols, God with us. And that's the first thing he was going to tell them. That when you think of God, don't think of many gods. Don't think of one God just sitting up there in the clouds, minding his own business, twiddling his thumbs. Think of the God who is closer to you than a heartbeat. Well, the families of Abraham and Sarah grew. They had sons. Those sons had families. And then a famine came along, and they had to go to Egypt, find some way to live. They settled in what's called Lower Egypt. Now, that can be misleading because I learned to read a map thinking lower was on the southern part, upper was on the north. But the Nile flows south to north. And so the lower geographical of the Nile is the northern edge, up around where the Nile meets the Mediterranean Sea. The Hebrews settled there. They did very well. They multiplied in numbers. They multiplied in wealth. And then the government changed. And suddenly, they were not popular anymore. And the Egyptian government enslaved them, oppressed them, and actually, in many ways, started a program of genocide against them. And what were they going to do? And that's when they discovered the second key thing about their God. And that is that this is a God stronger than other gods. This is a God who is with them, and this is a God stronger than other gods. Remember that back then everybody assumed, including the Hebrews, that there were many gods. And the question was, how did their God stack up against other gods? And you can imagine how terrifying it was for them. I mean, to be in the land of the Pharaohs and to see the pomp and the circumstance of the Egyptian gods depicted in the statuary, and to see to be so intimidated by the gods of the Egyptians. And the Hebrews never forgot what it was like when Moses led them to the Red Sea and led them across, and the Pharaoh's soldiers were drowned. And suddenly they began to realize that the God who was with them was also the God who could take on all adversaries, even if in sometimes surprising ways. They got back to Israel. They built the nation. In its day, the kingdom of David, who was one of their greatest, he was their greatest earthly king, the kingdom of David and some of the kingdoms following him, it was the strongest nation in that part of the world. And as you read the New Testament, as you read the Old Testament, the Old Testament, you'll see chapter after chapter, book after book of the history of this nation. And if you don't watch out as you read it, Samuel and David and Solomon and all of this, and wars and people attacking them and the nation fighting for survival, and, things they did right and things they did wrong. It reads like just a regular history, but that's not actually what's going on. In the Ten Commandments, the Hebrews received a foundation for building their civilization and for understanding their God. Because in the Ten Commandments, they came to understand that their God was a God of righteousness and mercy. Righteousness and mercy. And that's the next thing they learned. And that was hard. That was hard to learn. We forget, we moderns, how terrifying the ancient gods were. How terrifying they were. You didn't want one of those ancient gods with you. You wanted to keep them as far away from you as you could, and the role of religion was to placate them or buy their favor. And by the way, please remember, when we talk about those ancient gods, Seth and Baal and Ashtaroth and all the others, they're just as modern as today. Every one of them stood for things like wealth, health, power, pleasure. Anybody think those are not worship today? You bet they're worship. And I want to tell you something. Even as the ancient gods were dangerous, so are the modern ones. And the modern ones will destroy you if that's really what you think you're going to worship and what you're going to pursue in your life. This was not a God like the other gods. This was a God of righteousness and mercy. And for the next hundreds of years, they tried to build a society, practically speaking, living that out. And it wasn't easy, but they made progress, and they had to wrestle with it. In Leviticus 19, God says, "You shall be holy, for I am holy." What does it mean to be holy for this God? It means to live a life of righteousness and mercy. To live a life so that you are keeping your commitments, you are standing by your word, you are a person of integrity, you are keeping your covenants with others, you are standing for the right in this life, even when it is against your own self-interest. What does it mean to be merciful? It means to have compassion upon those who are less fortunate, compassion upon those who are hurting, compassion upon those who may have made a mess of their own lives. And it means knowing that when you make a mess of yours, you have a a God who will have compassion upon you. A radically new idea. And it took them a while to begin to live into it, but they made some progress, and then disaster hit. Disaster hit. They suffered a series of just terrible defeats. Israel, Palestine, the nation of Israel, is right atop two of the 5 major trade routes in the ancient world. And one reason you see so much war in the Old Testament is people were always trying to take them over. And they suffered terrible defeats, first from Assyria and then most famously from Babylon. And suddenly the people in Israel were carried off into slavery in Babylon. And if you look at a map, what that means is they went from Palestine along the eastern edge of the Mediterranean back to southern Iraq, back to within just a few miles of Ur, where Abraham and Sarah started out, back into the slavery they thought they'd left behind in Egypt, back into not having a homeland at all, and they were devastated. They were absolutely emotionally and spiritually destroyed. Psalm 137 was written in Babylon and has one of the most famous lines in the Bible: "How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land?" Can you hear the pain? And I want you to notice that, because you've known that pain. How can I sing the Lord's song with what is happening all around me? But in the midst of that seeming desolation, Ezekiel had a vision. And in the vision, he saw God high and lifted up on a throne. And suddenly, he saw the throne had wheels. And the throne turned into a chariot. And he realized, and the people of Israel realized, that even in the midst of their despair and seeming devastation, God had not been left behind. He was with them there. And realizing that, they got a new strength, they got a new direction, and they never forgot when they did get back to their homeland and they began rebuilding their nation, stronger even than it had been before. They never forgot what they had learned, that God is larger than any one place. God is larger than any one situation. And then building on that, they got another insight. And these things just kind of grew. God, through the prophets, showed them that even as God was bigger than any one place, any one situation, he was bigger than any one people. God was bigger than Israel. We don't talk about this enough, in my opinion, but I think we should. God was bigger than Israel. And the Hebrew prophets themselves were saying that God was bigger than Israel. God was the only God. God was the God overall. And they reclaimed Genesis 12, that original marching orders given to Abraham and Sarah, that they were to be blessed so that God through them could bless the whole world. And my friends, I think we need to take this seriously. You know, I'll have people ask me when we talk about the Old Testament, they'll say, "Dr. Wende, why is there so much bloodshed?" I mean, it's just horrible to read in the first part of the Old Testament, all this war and stuff. And part of that is because it was a barbaric time. They were they were on top of the major trade routes. They were fighting for survival. But there's another dimension here. As you read the beginning of the Old Testament, you know, they just seem to think this is okay. Go on to the end of the Old Testament. By the end of the Old Testament, they have a very different perception about warfare. In fact, by the time Jesus was born, when you went into the synagogue and the children were taught by the rabbi in the rabbi would teach them about Moses and the Hebrews crossing the Red Sea, and he would teach them about the Pharaoh's soldiers coming after them to bring them back into slavery or kill them, and he would teach them about the water coming in over the soldiers' heads. And then the rabbi would say to the children, "Now, what did God do as the waters drowned Pharaoh's soldiers?" And the children would all say, "God cheered." And the rabbi would say, "No, God cried." Because these were his children too. Do you see how this works? This amazingly new and unique understanding of God. Until by the time Jesus was born, Jerusalem had become famous for two things. One, as an amazingly beautiful city, one of the most beautiful on earth. And secondly, that on its high and holy days, it would be jammed by what were called God-fearers, seekers after more information about this God from all over the Roman Empire, from all over other parts outside the empire, all trying to find out about this amazingly unique God. Now, very quickly, we're going to move on in just a moment, but let me stop. I've listed 5 things. Do you know and are you living with the knowledge that your God is always with you and you are never alone? Do you know and are you living with the knowledge that your God is more powerful than any adversary that can come against you? Do you know and are you living with the knowledge that yours is a God of righteousness and mercy, and when you forget those two, you begin to move away from Him? Do you know and are you living with the knowledge that He loves every place on this earth? And do you know and are you living with the knowledge that He loves every person on this earth, even those who do not love Him back? Think about it. Because those were the truths God used with the people to begin to prepare their hearts so they could recognize Christ when He intervened. And I want us to take that seriously, my friends, because I want to go back to what I said earlier. I truly believe Jesus Christ intends to intervene in your life in ways large or small, in one way or another, this Christmas. And why is this message so important to me to share with you? Because, you know, there was one final thing God showed the prophets. Final thing is wrong. He showed them so much. But one more major learning God showed the prophets that I think we need to take very seriously. Namely, that we have a God who is so large. He is larger than any place, larger than any one people, larger than any other pretend gods, but also a God large enough to become very small. Large enough to become very small. He is not limited by anything, including His own size. A God large enough to become small enough to fit into the unique needs and hidden secrets and shadowy pains inside your heart and mine. A God who will sometimes thunder, but sometimes simply push the doorbell when we're too busy to want to answer the door. A God who would become a child, that in Himself He might bring heaven to earth, and through His life He might begin the process of bringing earth to heaven.